7-year-old boy who said at our group, I'm so glad that we have this group for us to come together because I know I'm dying of my brain tumor, but if I try to talk to my mom or dad, they just start crying and I don't want to make them sad.
Uh-huh.
And at that point, anytime somebody comes to me and says, well, we're not telling the kids about this, I'm like, I don't know if you've met your children, but if you want to know what's going on in your family, your kids, they know everything.
Susan Barber has been doing end-of-life work for over 30 years, the first 10 working with people with AIDS and cancer. Susan lived in San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic and says this changed her life. She then spent 20 years working in hospice, training community members as volunteers to support patients and families. She's now the community education manager at Mission Hospice and Home Care. This is an episode with a little bit of a difference. Olivier and I are staying out of the way and say very little as Susan tells her story. It includes everything from how her life's work came to her, her grandmother's death, stealing Elizabeth Kubler Ross's book from the library, her friends dying from AIDS before we knew what AIDS was, why she always decides to act when something happens to her 3 times, and weeping at a Bruce Springsteen concert. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media. And to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, please sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, grab a hot drink, put your feet up, and get ready for this episode. Fear is not driving the bus.
Like many people, I grew up in a family that didn't really believe in death. My first death experience of my grandmother's death was very traumatic and involved a lot of screaming on my mother's part and not us really understanding what was going on. She was in the other room when the phone call came. My grandmother was living apart from our family at the time, and so my mother just literally got the information and started to sob and scream, and she was not a particularly emotional person. My brother and I were in the next room, and we heard this and ran to the kitchen and literally hid underneath the table watching her as my father ran downstairs with my 2 little brothers under the arm. My other sister wandered in, and there was a very big commotion. When we were noticed, my father just sent us back to the breakfast table and got us ready and, go to school, you're going to be late. This was my introduction to death. And when we got home, other than my mother being very tearful, it was as if nothing had happened and we were just supposed to just carry on. I don't think that that's that unusual. We were not allowed to attend the funeral. My grandmother was just gone from our life with no explanation. That's kind of what framed my understanding of what death was about. It was a sort of very scary, emotional, terrible thing where somebody just disappears with no explanation. I was curious about that, though didn't really occur to me to think too much about it. At 13 years old, I was spending an inordinate amount of time at the public library where the librarians gave me like a little job to do where I would get new books that were coming in and check them and put them on the shelves where they belonged. And when I was 13, I opened a box and the top book was Elizabeth Kubler Ross on Death and Dying. At the time, it was like finding some sort of illicit material that I actually didn't look at it for a minute. And then I looked back and I thought, I was a pretty honest kid. I don't know what came over me, but I took that book and I shoved it into a bag that I had brought to the library, and I basically stole it. And I went home and I read it with a flash under my covers because I knew my parents would never, ever let me read this book. And it was a short book, so it didn't take me long to read. But at the end of it, I remember this overwhelming feeling of, well, thank God somebody knows what's going on in this world. And then I took the book back and, Dewey Decimaled it and put it up on the shelf where it belonged and didn't really think too much about it again. I went to a Jesuit college. I was in a class my senior year that combined my studies in sociology and in religious studies, which was my major. And it was on death and dying with an elderly Jesuit priest and a sort of young sociologist. It became very clear to me during the course of the class that the priest, who was quite old, was not really interested in conversation around death. He had an idea about what this was, and our job was to sort of take that on. And as a student, I went and spoke to the sociology professor and just said, this isn't really working for me because I think this is something that's kind of mysterious. He agreed. I got an A in the class and then didn't really think about this again for a couple of years. When I was 23, I did a cross-country trip and landed in San Francisco. Apparently arrived about 10 minutes before the HIV virus, though we didn't meet for many years, probably 5 or 6. And during the early days in San Francisco, a couple of my friends died of very mysterious circumstances that the doctors couldn't explain and seemed flu-like with other conditions, which later on I realized they probably were people that were very early on sick with AIDS. I'm a very good friend of mine who was a straight guy. He was our softball coach. He developed a brain cancer that was very unusual, and he was 37 years old. After being diagnosed after months of illness and not understanding what was happening, we were a softball team that was sponsored by a local bar. So we were all in the bar one night, and he was giving me a ride home. And he said, so this has happened to me. I'm going to die. They told me I have 3 months. Like anybody in that situation in that age, I had no idea what to do, except I tried desperately to get out of the car and do anything but have this conversation. And he said to me, can you tell me what I should do? And I was like, why do you think I could tell you what to do? Because what I want to do is go back and have some more bourbon in that bar. And he said, well, because you're in therapy, so you should know more than the rest of us. And I think you're trying to be not so effed up as the rest of us, and you're at least making an effort. And I was like, I did actually go and ask my therapist, bless her heart. She gave me some resources. One was a local place in Marin. It was called the Center for Attitudinal Healing, which was based on a book by an author named Jerry Jampowski. And it chronicled his experience of having sort of an epiphany that he should assemble a group of terminally ill or life-threatened children and observe how they behaved with each other. And this was sort of a message he got from, he didn't quite know where. He was a very well-respected psychiatrist in Marin County. He didn't know what else to do, so he assembled a group of children who had life-threatening or life-limiting illnesses. There was about 7 children in the first group, and he just observed how they supported each other. And from those observations, he wrote a book called Love is Letting Go of Fear. Jerry's book was very impactful, and my therapist recommended for my friend who was ill that there were very many support groups at this place, including groups for people with terminal illness, also groups for people who were interested in or caregivers of people who were ill. The sort of underlying idea that the only thing we really can change in our lives is our attitudes about things, including our attitudes about death and suffering. I started, after recommending this to Jeff and he started to go to these groups, we would drop him off and go to the bar next door. And after seeing, Jeff lived for almost over 3 years, which astounded all of his doctors. They couldn't explain it. I'm somewhat ashamed to say this, although it's just part of the story. This is actually true. From the time I gave him that information, for the next 3 years, I really avoided him. And during this time, I was involved with another group that was looking at sort of a contemplative way to be in an urban environment. And so there was a group of Christian monks and some lay people that would meet, of course, in Berkeley weekly for this group. And during that time, a gentleman in that group who was a Christian monk invited me to hear a gentleman speak whose name was Stephen Levine. And he said, and I was like, okay, I don't know why why do you think I would, what's that about? And he said, well, he does talks about conscious living, conscious dying. And the truth is I had a huge crush on this person and I would have gone anywhere with, but I thought, have you completely missed the point that I've been avoiding this? Like more than anything else, my energy has been to avoid this conversation around death because I don't see my friend. I'm not really interested in going to hear a 2-hour talk about death and dying, no matter how conscious it is. I just don't really think so. But what I said is, oh, of course, that sounds so interesting. So I did go with him. I'll never forget that night because there's this church. It's quite a large church. It was packed with people. I mean, people sitting on the floor, people sitting in the aisles, people, hundreds and hundreds of people. And this guy got up and started talking to us. And we were there for probably, I'd say 2 or 2.5 hours. And there were many times during this talk where I thought, I've gone to college. I'm a fairly well-educated person. I don't know what the hell this guy is talking about. Open your heart in hell, soften your belly, death isn't the problem. I'm like, so we left. And my friend said to me, so what did you think? And I said, I think I haven't lived in California long enough because I don't understand a word that guy's talking about. Like, what the hell what the hell? Like, what was he talking about? My friend kind of explained to me what he was talking about. And I was like, yeah, that's great. And I went back to where I was staying, which was actually a house sit for some friends. And of course, the first thing I did was turn on the television. And she had it set for the public education station. And there was this grainy black and white video montage of basically two heads, three heads, like, and they were going in and out of focus and these guys talking. And I'm like, how are these people talking about? I picked up a book. I figured the TV distraction isn't working. Here's a book she's left me. And I picked up this book, and it was called Meetings at the Edge. I started reading it. It was about death stories of people that were dying by this person, Stephen Levine, and his wife, who were taking these people kind of in and also providing a 24-hour hotline for anybody in the country that could call and have a conversation with them about their death. They're living with the knowledge that they were dying imminently experiencing. And then I picked up the book and went over to the TV, and the back jacket picture was the same guy that was on the TV, who was the same guy whose talk I had just come to from. And I thought, I had an agreement with myself in those days. I'd gone to some 12-step programs. I was seeing a therapist. I was doing all the things you do in California in your 20s in those days. And I thought if anything came to me 3 times, I just did whatever it was. So here's Stephen on the TV, in the book, and then in this lecture. And I just thought, okay, this has happened. I don't know what to make of it. But almost a month to the day of that talk, my friends who were caring for Jeff on a sort of daily basis called in a panic. And they said, listen, he's really sick and he's on the toilet and we can't get him up. And you live closer than anybody else. You have to come over right now. And I was like, sure, okay, great, I'm on my way. So I went over, and they had managed to get him back into the bed. But I went in to look at him, and I said, look, you guys, I really know nothing about this. He's the color of his walls. He had this very gray bedroom. And I'm like, that's just not a good sign. And his eyes are yellow. I think we should take him to the hospital. And the woman that was primarily with him most of that, those 3 years that I was gone, she said, I've promised Jeff that wouldn't happen. And I said, well, I understand that, but you've called me to come here. And all I can say to you is the only thing I would think to do, given how very ill he looks and how very unqualified we are to make any kind of health decision, is that we should probably take him to the hospital. And so his parents were coming that week. The friends agreed that we should go to the hospital. So they took him in the ambulance came and took him out. And as they were going down the stairs, they said, you have to call his parents. The phone number are on their table. So I called his family and I said, you need to come now. They weren't quite getting it. I said, he's in the emergency room at the hospital. I think you should come. They said, well, we're coming on Friday. I said, no, you should come now. It's Saturday. You should come now. So they did. From that point on, I was with them pretty much every day with Jeff. This was in early April. One of the first days that I was there, I spent the night, and Jeff had a very prescribed way that he wanted people to be with him, which I was not privy to when I agreed to spend the night. But his dad, who was still there, his mom had to go home. So the way she managed that grief is to go home and attend to her family there. But the dad stayed and overcame so many ideas that he had about his family life and what this would be for his family. And Jeff was very, very ill when he came back. At one point when he was in the hospital, he was in a little cubicle in the emergency area. Some friends were there, and for some reason they all stepped out with a doctor. And he and I were in this cubicle together, and it was one of the first times I had seen him in a long time. And I thought he was actually dead, and I was standing next to the gurney he was on, and he opened his eyes and he just looked at me and said, don't let me die here. And I was like, should have paid more attention to that guy talking at that church. But I just said, okay, we won't do that. We were able to bring him home with his father. And the night I stayed over, his father said to me, well, the agreement that Jeff asked people if they're spending the night is to sleep in the bed with him. And I was like, yeah, no, because, that's, not appropriate. We don't have that kind of relationship. And, that's going on in my head. And his dad said, he's so afraid and his brain is just not working. And so he wakes up very fearful in the night. And what he likes to just be able to reach over and like pat somebody's arm to know that he's like there's somebody with him. And I said, sure, yeah, that seems reasonable. And I wrote a 15-page letter to a friend of mine that night. It was about 3 a.m. when I finished writing everything I could imagine that person would ever be willing to read. And then I had to go to bed. And I went to bed and had some very bizarre dreams. And Jeff was in the bed, barely breathing. I had a dream that he actually tried to get out of the bed to do something. I wasn't sure what it was. I woke up really in a panic, and I realized I woke up because he was patting my arm. And so I woke up, and he needed to be changed. And his father said, I got his dad. And his dad's like, yeah, that's the one thing I can't do, but I'm so glad you're here because you can do that. And I'm like, sure. Yeah. So I did actually change him. And during that process, it was just like a very tender thing. And I really had a felt sense of how scared he was. And I can't explain what happened, but after he was changed, his dad gave him his medication. His dad would sit in the kitchen for hours with oranges, because in those days, giving morphine was subcutaneous. You'd give it under the skin. And he would practice with these oranges, shooting these oranges with, a needle, trying to get it just under the orange part and not into the white part, because if he got it in, like for Jeff, that would have hurt. And I was just so moved watching his father, he kissed his forehead, he mopped his brow. And I thought, you know what, you just need to do whatever you can here. So I sat next to the bed, and Jeff was, kind of out again. He was in a coma for most of this time. And I just put my hand on top of his arm, and I said, quietly to myself, I'm just going to sit here and close my eyes because I don't know what else to do. Because I was working in the stock market, a lot of information came to me like in ticker tape, and what came across my mind was, you can keep your heart open even in hell, and soften your belly. And it came like on a continuous loop, those two sentences. I didn't know what else to do, so I did those things. And while I was doing them, I realized, oh my God, it's that guy, Stephen Levine. Like, he's in my head. And he had said a couple of times when people had raised their hands and asked questions, don't worry about the context of what I'm talking. You don't need to take notes. You just need to trust that when you need this information, it will be available. So here I am having this very deep experience, and I could feel Jeff when I did those things. I softened my belly, and I trusted that I could keep my heart open even in this hellish situation. And Jeff's body completely relaxed. Like, I could feel him in my hand, like holding his hand. It just completely relaxed, and his breathing changed, and my breathing changed. And I had an experience that, being a New Yorker, I thought I was losing my mind, but I trusted this experience. What happened is I started to have this feeling that Jeff and I were both sort of drifting away. And it was very peaceful. It was very beautiful. And it was probably the closest I ever felt to him. And I had known Jeff at this point for 5 or 6 years. It was so peaceful. And there came a point where it was very clear this was all unspoken. He was in what I thought was a coma. And it was like he was drifting past a point where I couldn't go. I just continued to keep my belly soft and my heart as open as I could. And the downstairs door in the apartment slammed. And we both went like this, like literally. And he opened his eyes, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, that just happened, right? And I was like, yeah, that just happened. And so at that point, I gave up everything that I thought I knew about anything. A couple of weeks later, our softball team was going to the championships, despite Jeff's illness. And a dear friend who was really very important in his care was there. She had assumed his role as our softball manager. We were gathered at the bedside, and I was not playing in the championship because I was going to see my idol Bruce Springsteen that night. And Jeff's father, in the weeks leading up to this both championship game and night of Bruce Springsteen, had heard me talk about Bruce so much he had pasted all over the refrigerator, instead of children's artwork, articles about Bruce Springsteen, a man he knew nothing about before arriving at his dying son's bedside. But everybody was so excited on this evening. And so we were over Jeff's bed. He was really, really gone at that point, we thought. And my friend was saying something about the game and how difficult people had been because she had to move a lot of people around. And Jeff opened his eyes and kind of sat up a little bit and goes, it's a bitch. And then went back down on the bed. We looked around. We were like, Barb was like, oh, yeah, it's a bitch. And then we were like, did we give him this brain cancer? Like, was it so stressful for him that we caused this? But we all went our separate ways. I went to see Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen, it was a really incredible night. It was a beautiful night. It was an outdoor amphitheater. And Bruce sang a song about his relationship with his father. And as he was singing, I was overcome. I'm not a super emotional person, but I was overcome with this vision, like he's singing about his father and their relationship growing up. And my images were all about Jeff and his father sitting in the kitchen, with like candlelight, with this orange and this needle, and wiping his son's brow. And I just thought, this is, this relationship with fathers and sons is so incredibly intimate and so very distant. At the end of that song, people are screaming and I'm sitting there like literally weeping. And I had another experience that I can't explain except to say it was an epiphany, because a voice as clear as yours or my roommate who was sitting next to me screaming, I was crying and she turned around and looked at me. She goes, "That was great, wasn't it?" And I was like, stunned, because a voice said to me, "You've seen Jeff for the last time alive. The next time you'll see him, he'll be dead. And you don't need to understand this. And you don't even need to accept this. You just need to know that this is your life. This is like your work. And this is just the first time this is happening. And this is going to be happening for the rest of your life. You're just going to go and do this." I can't explain, I knew in my heart, my head was like, oh, hell to the no, that is not happening. But in my heart, by this point, 2 of my best friends had been diagnosed with AIDS. 3 or 4 others were quite likely going to be diagnosed. Friends from all over the country were sick with AIDS. I just sat there in the chair weeping, and I remember looking up at this night was so full of stars, and I just said out to the universe, if there's any way I can ever repay this man for this experience, I will do whatever I can. Jeff died, actually, that I went home that night having just no idea what the hell was happening to my life. I went home that night, and at 6 in the morning, I got a phone call saying, "Jeff died, come right now." And I went over, and I arrived. I drove like a maniac. I arrived before the ambulance and the fire trucks came. The woman that was staying the night just, did what we're trained to do, call 911. And Jeff didn't want that at all. But at this point, there was a hospice worker coming. We got Jeff ready to be taken away. We cleaned him, we bathed him, we dressed him in something that he would want to go out of the house with, which was not his hospital kind of gown. It was a profound day to be there. More things happened after that I had no way to explain. But I started going to any Stephen Levine workshop that I could find. And luckily, he was coming quite often to the Bay Area. That fall, I went with a friend of mine who had AIDS to hear him speak for a residential workshop. He and I connected more personally at that, and his wife, Andre, was there. It was the first time I met her. But it was the beginning of a 30-year relationship that I think saved my life. I also during this time met a group of Buddhist monks and nuns and was going religiously to the Center for Attitudinal Healing at this point, and was in a support group for people who were caring for those who were dying, and downstairs in the group for those who were life-threatened. So I spent time, about 6 years, in the caregivers group because more friends were dying, and my friend Bob, who was sort of a soulmate, he asked me once he was diagnosed with HIV if I would accompany him to his death. He was in a relationship that probably would have ended if he hadn't been diagnosed, but like many couples during that time in San Francisco, people stayed together for all sorts of reasons. Bob and I did a lot of spiritual work around his impending death and also his illness and how to navigate that. That also was a transformative experience because there was a lot of a realization on my part that we connect, in many ways as human beings. And a lot of the way we connected was through conversation, but we connected in a lot of other ways that I still, I don't have any explanation for these things, but I know that there was a lot of times where he and I just knew things about each other that we hadn't spoken about and we trusted. And I was with Bob for 6 months. He was in a hospital for the last 6 months of his life. There was so many things that happened during that time that just sort of allowed me to let go of my ideas about how living on this planet really is. Before Bob's death, a very close mutual friend died, and at that point, Bob had excused himself like I had with Jeff. I was very angry about that because Bill was his best friend and one of my closest friends, and Bill really suffered. Bill developed Alzheimer's dementia, and Bill and I also had prepared for probably 2 or 3 years for his death without ever considering that he might have Alzheimer's and forget all the stuff that we had done, which is funny now, but during the time it was extraordinarily frustrating. Bill's death, before he died, he was hospitalized, and like many of the hospitals in the early days of HIV, they had no idea what to do with people with this illness except to sort of segregate them. So Bill found himself in a hospital. He was a 40-something-year-old guy with dementia, cachectic. He was like a skeleton, like many people in San Francisco. It was like walking through I don't know if either of you have seen the movie Coco, where everybody's a skeleton, and it's the new Pixar film, but this is what San Francisco, the Castro looked like during those days. People walking death. Bill and his dementia, this was something new for me. I had no idea how to navigate this. So I saw Bill in the hospital. He was straitjacketed one day when I came in because he was causing problems, and I thought, this is crazy. Like, he's 90 pounds and he's in a bed that he can't get up out of and he's demented. Like, what kind of problems could he possibly cause that you as a medical professional could not help resolve in a better way than straitjacketing him in the bed? Moving him was essential. And the night before he was going to be moved, I said, I'm going to come to the hospital and spend the night, because they called me. He was very distraught. And when I arrived, it took a number of hours to calm him down, because he knew something momentous was happening, but he didn't know what it was or how to place it, because they had told him that day they were going to move him to a hospice. I went and spent the night with him. It took him a couple of hours to get him kind of calmed down in the bed. He finally calms down. They'd moved a bed in for me to stay, and I got in the bed, and I was just like, thank God. And I say maybe 4 minutes later, Bill says, okay, it's time to get up. And I was like, the hell? And he said, and I said, why? And he said, well, because it's Saturday. And he had like a list. He was a very he was a guy that should have been born in the 20s. He was a very elegant man. He was a very bright man. He was a very man of habit. And his habit on Saturdays was to do a bunch of things, like go to the tea guy, get his dry cleaning done. He was a caterer, which is how I met him. So he starts listing all the things he does on Saturdays. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, this is great because it's Wednesday. So I'll just explain that and this will resolve this. I had learned not to really argue with him. He was sitting up in bed at that point. I thought, okay, my strategy to navigate this is I'll give him his socks. I know he can't put them on. Once he can't put them on, he'll just, want to go back to sleep. So I get his socks, give them to him. I sit down on the bed next to him. He clearly cannot put the socks on. And he gets very frustrated, and he got very angry when he got frustrated. And I said, but don't worry, because tomorrow is not Saturday, Bill. It's Wednesday. And he laid back on the bed, and instead of going off on a tirade, what he said to me is, Susan, there's a lot of things that people stand outside of, and reality is one of them. And I got really interested at this point. And he began to explain the time-space continuum as a convenience for people like me, who was in a 3D body and very grounded in this world. But to him, who was sort of in the mezzanine and in the elevator going back and forth, sometimes he was here and sometimes he was somewhere else. It didn't matter that I thought tomorrow was Wednesday or that he thought tomorrow was Saturday. He said, I know what matters to you, but what's important to me is that when you come, you love me. And he kind of waved his hand. He said, and these other people, they don't have the time of day. They don't care at all about me. What he was telling me was his experience being inside of being close to death, is that the way he's relating to the world isn't in the solid form that we are in, but in some other sort of more fluid form. Stephen Levine talked about this a lot at his workshops, about the process of dying was sort of moving through the formations of solid, liquid, and gas, like many things move. He would use the example of an ice cube, which is very solid in that form, and as it starts to change, it will melt, and then it becomes gas. It will evaporate it back into the air. And it was just so clear to me with Bill in this experience he was trying to articulate that this was similar to what he was experiencing. We arrived the next day at the hospice, and the nurse, the admissions nurse, came in, and Bill and I were sitting in the room. And it was a double room. There was another person that we could see very emaciated on the bed in the room. And the man is getting Bill's vitals, and he says, so, your name, and Bill could tell him his name. And he says to him, well, do you live alone? And Bill looks across the room, and he goes, well, apparently not. And I was like laughing because it was so true. And we just kind of went along with whatever Bill wanted to do. He celebrated his 45th birthday in this hospice house, and they were amazing to him. It was a beautiful experience. When he died, Bernice and I, both very educated people, sat next to the bed, and we looked at each other and we were like, is he dead? I don't know. I think this is why they have nurses in places like this. So I went and got a nurse, and she came up, and Bill was laying in a bed with an open window, and we were both so very clear that what we noticed but couldn't explain was that he left through the window. Like there was something that left the room, and then he was dead. And so the nurse came and confirmed that, yes, indeed, he was dead. And we had, some time with him afterwards. I don't really know why, but I explained to him, and had done the same thing with Jeff. I said, I don't really know what you're experiencing right now, but in case you can hear me, and in case you're confused at all about what's happening, you've died. You're not in a coma. Whatever's going on for you, just keep going, because we'll handle whatever we need to handle here. And just thank you for letting me be here with you. I did that because at the Center for Attitudinal Healing, I was also involved. I had started to facilitate a group with young adults who had life-threatening illness. So these were people between 14 and 20 years old that had a life-limiting illness. One guy came to the group who had been in a vegetative coma for 6 months and came out of it. And he was able to articulate very clearly that there were many, he didn't really have a concept for time because he was in a coma. But it turned out he had a brainstem aneurysm at 21 years old in New York in an underground parking lot where people walked over him. He was still conscious. They left him on the ground because they thought he was drunk. And his speech was so slurred that and finally a very compassionate young woman came and realized he was having a medical problem, called the ambulance. And that was the last thing he remembered. And then 6 months later, he comes to in this rehab facility. The first things he did was he fired everybody on his care team except the aide who was bathing him and a nursing assistant, because he had heard many of the conversations. He could tell us what he had heard in this coma state. After this experience with Gabe, I don't know what happens at death, and I don't know if this helps people at all. But if I'm ever with somebody at the moment of their death, I do say these things to them because I don't know about that transitional state. Once we die, I think our ability to sort of mark what's happening is very still primitive. We can tell the body, the heart stopped. There does seem to be some research that brain activity continues for some time after the heart stopping. So I just say this, and basically it makes me feel a little bit better at that moment. I was with both Bill and Bob when they died, and with Bob, we were together for quite a while. Before that, I was in the hospital. It was very clear that he was transitioning. A few months prior to this, we had conversations. He had still a person that he was in a relationship that was, at that point, involved in another relationship, and that did not allow Bob to come home. And Bob didn't know about that for quite some time, and when he found out, it was very crushing at first, but then a relief because he could get on with what he was doing, which was dying at that point. He was living with the intention that he wanted to die well, and when he realized he wasn't going to get to go home, he could let go of a lot of ideas other than this is what's happening right now. His health declined quite a bit during the time. He was able to make amends with his family. His parents were very evangelical Christians, and they felt like their son having AIDS was really difficult. They didn't know how to navigate that. They didn't know how to manage that. They lived in Kansas and would come to California to be with him. Before Bob's death, his doctor one day took him off for a couple of days off his medications just to see the changes of his mind, were those around dementia or were those just medication. During that time, he picked up the phone one day and he called his parents and had one of these sort of come to Jesus conversations. And he just said, look, I just love you guys and I want you to love me. And I'm sorry that I wasn't the person that you expected your son to be. This is what's happened in my life. I want you to be as comfortable as you can with this. And I really hope that you can talk to people so that you can come to some resolve in your life. And that conversation prompted his parents to go to their pastor, whose brother had just died of AIDS. So once the cat was out of the bag, it became a healing opportunity in their community because they brought this out in their church and started to participate in the AIDS quilt and doing things in that church to be more inclusive for people that were suffering. And Bob died before he knew that, but I thought that was sort of a miracle of his illness. At Bob's death, he had done something very smart a few months earlier. He had made me one of his powers of attorney, so I had the ability to speak for him when he was no longer able to speak for himself. But he didn't allow me to do that for his medical needs. He allowed me to do that for his finances. And I thought, okay, I don't know anything about your finances, and I'm here every day. Why? I was very angry when this happened. And I said, why wouldn't you have me make your medical decisions? The nurses, the people in the hospital come to me when they have concerns about your health. And he said, here's something that I think could be really difficult. There is going to come a time where I'm going to need medication. I'm going to need something that I might die after it's given. Maybe I need more morphine, and maybe I die shortly after that happens. And then what do? You walk out of the hospital room thinking that some decision you made may have hastened my death. And I don't ever want you to leave thinking that or doubting what you've done here. And I thought at the time I was so angry. And in the moment when it became clear that somebody needed to make a decision like this, the person that was brought in was I would say a friendly acquaintance, but not anybody close to him. And she walked into that room and she said, he's not comfortable and something needs to happen, which was something I couldn't see because I was at the bedside every day. And she was so clear about it. And they gave him more medication to make him comfortable. And I have to say that in that moment, I was so very relieved that I wasn't making that decision, that it's become a teaching point when I'm doing training with volunteers in hospice. I talk about this because, In a logical sense, it makes sense that somebody very close to us would be that person making the decision. But in terms of what we live with after a death of a person we care about, I can see the wisdom in that. And in most relationships that are like a spousal or partnership relationship, the person that's the caregiver is very invested. They love this person. And they also understand at some level that their life and identity is going to change when that person's gone. And so in ways subtle and maybe not so subtle, they're invested in that person staying alive. He took me out of that loop of having to be responsible or having to make those kinds of decisions. And I was very grateful in the moments when he was dying that I hadn't made that decision. His death and the experience that I had when he was dying, I had my hand over his heart and I was kind of holding him, just my hand under his shoulder for support, which I may or may not do now, knowing a little bit more about the death process. He took a couple of breaths, very deep and large breaths, and he had been also in a coma for many days at this point, and he sat up in that bed. And I'll tell you, I'm very glad that I had some meditation practice at that point and had spent many years softening my belly and keeping my heart open and held. By then I could see my mind going to a place that was like, what the heck? But that's not how I responded to that situation. So he came like up out of the bed and had this huge exhale and went back down. The person that he was in a relationship was sitting across the bed and was just like kind of shaking his head like, and then this happened 3 times. And on the third breath, I cannot explain this, but I had an electrical charge that went up my arm and through my body like somebody had plugged jumper cables into my heart, and he was gone. So I sat with him. I told him he had died. I was so grateful. People had come into the room over the months that we were there together. He had so many friends that were close to him, and so many people came in and visited him. That experience was profound for me, and I realized then, Elizabeth Kubler Ross, Stephen Levine will say the dying have so much to teach us. That experience of being with Bob at his death and seeing all the ways that people come and go from a room where somebody, and also how I came and went from a room. There were times where I was so uncomfortable with what was happening. I'm like, well, let's see, maybe it's too warm, maybe it's too cold, maybe we need the light on, maybe the light should be off. But, as Bill reminded me, it doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't matter. That you love the person, that you can maybe, fear's in the room with you sometimes, but fear is not driving the bus. Fear might be in the passenger seat dealing with maybe the radio, and it might be dealing with the temperature control, but fear is not driving the bus. The things that I was able to learn with Stephen around what's possible at death, and from Elizabeth Kubler Ross, I was so grateful in 1998 to have an opportunity to go and sit with Elizabeth in her living room in Arizona. She had had a couple of strokes by that. To be able to talk to her about some of these things, including stealing her book when I was 13, it was a remarkable experience to be able to see so many of these things. Now I look back and it seems like all of those things make sense. But at the time that they were happening, this wasn't a linear experience. The year that I got to go visit Elizabeth Kubler Ross, through a stroke of what I can only call miraculous events, I received a call from Bruce Springsteen's sister, who asked if I was a caterer also, if I could cater their parents' 50th wedding anniversary. His parents lived close to where I worked. I, of course, tried to be very professional about that. I said, let me check my calendar. I put the phone under a pillow and ran into my bedroom down the hall and put a pillow over my face and screamed at the top of my lungs, and then ran back and assured her that date was free. But I was so struck with that sort of thing that I had sent to the universe the day I had that epiphany at the Bruce Springsteen. If there's anything I could ever do for this man or his family, however small or large, I would do it. Just let me know what it could be. So I did end up catering his parents' 50th wedding anniversary. It was a small party just for their immediate family. There was about 20, and a neighbor. There was about 23 people there, and me and 2 of my closest friends that had also accompanied me with many of these deaths. His mom and I became very friendly. I was able to tell her this story about kind of what led up to this. And she's like, you have to tell Bruce. And I just said, I'm not so sure that he's so interested in this. But, it just seemed like so many things that seemed so bizarre. It's like the different pieces of a puzzle that you put together. Stephen and Andrea, I ended up working with them for years and met thousands of people. We put on events for them. We'd have 500 or 600 people coming together for a 2-day workshop on conscious living, conscious dying. Some of those people were actively dying. There were people that were coming on the floor on a cot for 2 days. There were people that were meditators. There were people that worked professionally in hospice. There were people that were caregivers. There were people that were bereaved. And those were amazing days. We did that for about 10 years. And I also would travel if they were going around the country to do a workshop, and I was selling their books and tapes for them, or helping, people, they gave away so many things, but help people find the material that was right for them and for their experience, and met people from all over the country that were engaged in this work. They retired in 1998, which was great for them. They were concerned that people were thinking that what they were that was that there's a right way to die, which is kind of the opposite of what they were saying. They were really encouraging people to engage in their life fully before their death, and to have their death as congruent with who they were as people as possible. And so this idea that there's a right way to do it, I think they were trying to bring some more light into the possibilities that can happen when we turn to face death, instead of trying to keep it at arm's length, or to keep it as something, as my father would say, this shouldn't happen to anyone. What happened after that time, during this time, my father also died. He had a very not good experience in hospice, and I hadn't worked in hospice, but I knew there was a better way to do it. And when Stephen and Andrea retired, I was given an opportunity to be a volunteer coordinator, and that was in 1997. So it was a way to coalesce all of this information. By that point, I had a dozen close friends, some family members die. And I thought at the end of that, well, clearly I'm not going back to the stock market or group home or catering, or I was also working in music, event production. Those things were wonderful, but at the end of my life, I thought, laying on my deathbed, are those the things, am I going to be like, it's great that people get to come and see Leonard Cohen at the Paramount Theater, and I'm not being facetious about that. That was a religious experience. But at the end of my life, what I really thought would be most helpful is to share the information about these teachings. And so since that time, about 650 people have come through the volunteer trainings that I've offered. And now I'm working in community education to bring this out to the wider community, in the hopes that people will never be in an emergency room making a decision about a loved one who seems to be dying without ever having had a conversation or resources or education about this information before that very, very frightening and not optimal time to make decisions about healthcare. The 7-year-old boy who said at our group, "I'm so glad that we have this group for us to come together, because I know I'm dying of my brain tumor, but if I try to talk to my mom or dad, they just start crying and I don't want to make them sad." And, that point, anytime somebody comes to me and says, well, we're not telling the kids about this, I'm like, I don't know if you've met your children, but if you want to know what's going on in your family, your kids, but they know everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but thank you guys. I just, of course, I hope I didn't do this wrong.
No, absolutely not.
I should have said, give me a signal, like if I'm talking too much, just put your hand on the top of the name of. I would just like to say that my gratitude, all of this, I feel so grateful to people that allowed me in to be with them during their illness, living with illness and at their deaths. For people that are afraid that's too burdensome for a family member or a friend to participate in, I'd like to disabuse you of that idea, because it's allowing people to be so close to a mystery that none of us understand. And it can be some of the most intimate moments in anybody's life, which is also a plug for being a hospice volunteer. But for Elizabeth Kubler Ross and Stephen Levine and Andrea Levine, who I continue to be a sister with, I'm just so grateful that also those people allowed me into their life. To the Buddhist monks and nuns that spend their entire monastic life contemplating impermanence, being allowed into their lives and to be part of the Center for Attitudinal Healing, those things were all just so formative. I'm just really grateful to have those experiences. So I don't know if there's any way to thank those people, like the rolling credits would be those.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.